might mean. So the hope today is that there might be a little discussion about what those mean, any elaboration on what those mean to individual members, and then the ultimate goal would be, a takeaway would be to come to some consensus on that ranking, and then at a future board meeting have those to be adopted. So that would be kind of the takeaway for the first session this afternoon. And with that, Jim's here to guide that discussion and help us out.
Well, thanks. And as Greg mentioned, we really want this to be an opportunity for you to really weigh in on where we left the discussion. We did not think that we left that meeting with everything fully discussed and hashed out. So we want to open this up for some discussion. And I know I'm not doing this right, so here we go. So here's the here's what was left on the board after we talked about it. The results in terms of priorities: downtown, transportation, parks, develop a growth plan, and again, the definition of the growth plan was really, how do we plan to grow? How do we plan to continue to provide services and facilities within our budget, facilities, economic development, etc. So you see that, and what we really want to do, and some other priorities. This discussion was update and refine the financial plan. It was decided that that would be automatically a goal for 2019. That would just be part of your work program. And then, again, the summary was downtown, transportation, parks, and the growth plan. So this is where we really want to stop and spend some time on. And these may not be perfectly framed questions, but what we want to do is have the board have a discussion among the commissioners. What you see are the thoughts and reflections on those goals, and we can go back to there so you can look at those again. But should they be reframed? Should they even be maybe reassessed? What questions, concerns do you have about the goals? What do you, based on those goals, what opportunities can you imagine for Waxhaw? But we don't want to leave that, leave those priorities and say, okay, everything's said that needs to be said on there. We don't think that is the case. We want, and we think they have to be digested a little bit more. So you've had plenty of time to sleep on it, and that's a good thing, because that gives us an opportunity to evaluate what was said, what was decided at that time, and rework that. So what would really be useful is if we just go back and take a look at these and just start a discussion, and we'll keep track of that discussion. I'm not too concerned about exactly where we end up with this. We may end up with just more elaboration on each of these. You may decide that these goals should be revoted on, and that's okay too. You may find that there's some other goals, but what we really want to encourage now is a discussion. And what I'd suggest is that we just, again, do kind of round robin, just have everybody speak up and express their views on what they think of these goals right now. And after that, after you all heard from each other, ask each other questions or just follow up on thoughts that you may have based upon what you've heard from others. So I would look for a volunteer, or I'll suggest a volunteer if no one wants to volunteer. Fred?
Just looking at the goals, let's assume for a moment that the goals are perfect. Okay. How do we go about accomplishing them? How do we find all the variables, the parts and pieces that make it up? What parts and pieces of each goal does the board have to provide? What does the staff have to provide? How do we have those discussions? I mean, we can sit around and talk all day and establish goals, but if we don't have the means or methods for accomplishing them, this is all a waste of time. So can you add to that?
Sure, I can briefly now, and then we'll go into more detail, because that's something that Greg and Kelly had asked us to address as well, because that is a core purpose of today's discussion, and talk about what's the role of the board, what's the role of the staff in terms of making these happen. And so we'll talk in a little bit we will talk in a lot more detail about the downtown. But basically, it goes back to that balanced decision process. So you've identified this is what you want to act on. This is where you want to invest your time in terms of prioritization of your energies and your efforts. Now it's up to staff. In each one of these cases, it's up to them to come back to you with a framework for the decisions that you will need to make to implement different parts of this. And again, what we recommend and what typically happens in these broader goals are there's no one big decision that you're going to make. There's a lot of smaller decisions, and actually that works out better. So they're going to frame that up. What are those smaller decisions that they can see now that you'll need to make? And then what information do they plan to provide to you so that you can make those decisions? That's an iterative process, which means that they're going to present that plan to you for your reaction and your refinement. You're going to want to change that. You're going to say, no, we don't want that information. We want something different. And that's fine. But that's going to give them the map to begin to put together that more detailed plan to bring you back the information you need to make so that you make the decisions in the different areas. Remember, and this is difficult sometimes for staff to embrace, but sometimes it is difficult for the elected officials. It's the responsibility of the staff to provide you unvarnished information. It's foolish for me to say that I never had a preconceived notion about what a board or elected official should decide. I always had a preconceived notion. But it's not my job to tilt the playing table. It's my job to give you that information in a balanced, unvarnished fashion, and for you to make up your mind. And I say that because as an experienced manager, and Greg's also an experienced manager, we know that a lot of times we're not right about an issue simply because we don't have the same perspective that you do. So we give you the unvarnished information, you make a decision, and then we make it happen. And that's how this will work out. The one other thing I'll say is that the path you start with in terms of implementing these is never going to be the same from beginning to end. It's always going to change. And redevelopment, and I will hopefully not bore you with details about that, but every redevelopment project we've worked on downtown, I consider redevelopment. Every one starts out different than it finishes, and every community, every project is different from that perspective. Does that answer your question?
For the most part, and I think as far as the goals themselves go, I personally am happy with the way they turned out. I think that from an anecdotal point of view, the downtown is pretty well going in the direction that we all wanted to go in. I think transportation is somewhat under control, what we can control of it. Parks is brand new, and that's going to require some in-depth discussion.
Good. Well, thanks.
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree. I don't know what downtown as a goal is. I mean, so we have to define what that really means. Develop a growth plan. My interpretation of that was, when we met, was more along the lines of how do we maintain our current levels of service while the town continues to control guess the update and refine really goes hand in hand with the other four, because without it, none of them are sustainable.
And downtown, the only thing we really said was ULI, the building. We really haven't had the discussion about where we go with that.
Yeah, there's a couple things you said are really important as follow-up, and we'll get into more detail as we go along. But the first part of that is, you're right, these aren't really goals. They aren't stated like goals. They're goal areas. And we're gonna talk about that with downtown. One of the first things you're gonna need to do is put up at least what I call a placeholder goal in place. So you don't have that now, and you don't need to have it right today. You're gonna need to have it a couple months down the line, and that goal is gonna likely be refined as we go along. The second part of what you said was also extremely important, and you talked about the financial plan. Remember we talked about the fact that the reason that there's more than one elected official is that you come at it from different perspectives. And I see this with this board, and that's very helpful. There's a desire to make sure that we have everything nailed down and update and refine the financial plan. That's what you're saying. And that is important. But the reality is we're in a very changing environment. So you're going to have to live with a rather imperfect financial plan for the first few years. In fact, we talked about that. The communities that stick with having and you're really using that financial plan as opposed to a budget. Again, it's not a budget, it's a financial plan. It's 5 years before it really starts to be something that they say they trust it and they think it's really useful. It takes 5 years. Why? Because it takes that long to identify the areas that need to be refined, and then to get the information. Because the other part of that is your staff that has very limited time has to provide that information, that they have to give you that information, and you have to digest it, and it just takes them time. Again, I did that for a living, consulting. We did that with dozens of communities. And when I had to do my own in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, when I had to do that, I gave myself probably a C- grade the first time we did it, and I'm supposed to be one of the top experts. Why? Because you just don't know. I wasn't there long enough, and even if I was, I don't have all that information. So good. These are exactly what we needed to do, is have this type of discussion. So let's keep going. Good. Well, let's keep going. Comments in terms of what you see here. Tracy?
Well, I like to narrow it down more into specific goals. I like the downtown and refining that as we discuss. Also the parks, mainly because we've just spent money on updating a plan, and I'd hate to see us make another plan and not put things into action. So I think that would be a good one. Something that's not up here that would be a goal to me that I think is on your other screen, but would be the town hall and public works, because that's something that we know we are going to have to make a decision on. So I think that it would be important to really start discussing that seriously, because that's not going to go away. And some of those other things up there, such as, well, on your previous screen, I mean, the financial plan, the growth plan, the transportation plan, those are kind of really large and things that encompass maybe some of the other things we're talking about. And even as far as transportation goes, sometimes we're limited based on other variables such as CRT, PO, DOT, whatever. And we maybe not be able to do what we want to do for funding reasons with that. So I would like to see us be more specific to downtown parks and then the facilities, because those are things we really start.
What do you mean by specific? Because I look at that list and I don't see one of them that can fall off. slide. We're
Right.
gonna have to talk about it at some point and update the financial plan, and we know that impact all the way up to the top of the downtown. So maybe back to you, Jim, are you trying to help get us to narrow down 4 or 5, knowing that all these have to be in play?
Yeah, all I can tell you is you can only really seriously work at one thing at a time in terms of what you're working on. This gives your staff, and it be intended to do this, should give your staff and you an idea of where you want them to prioritize. Because remember, 80% of your time and their time is tied up in what I call ministerial duties, stuff that just gets in front of you and you've got to deal with it whether you like it or not. So that a limited amount of time, and that's what you're doing today. You're carving out some separate time to try to work on these issues. And that's what you're going to need to let your manager know, is how much time you can really tolerate that. And it is important to recognize that you should not be, you shouldn't be in town hall 40 hours a week working on these different issues, because you need to be out in the community. You're going to discourage other people from continuing to participate if you do that. So you are just going to have to balance that out a little bit. But this should be an indication. Now, there will be other opportunities. Something's going to happen. I will guarantee you something will happen in the next year that's going to bump your schedule out, and something on that list is going to potentially get bumped down because there's another opportunity or a problem that you're going to have to deal with, and you'll spend more time on that. But I would encourage you to think about identifying what's a chunk of time, either at our regular meetings or separate from our regular meetings. What's a chunk of time that we're going to tell the staff, we're going to tell the manager, that we want to dedicate to these top priorities? And then let them come back with a schedule of how they might facilitate that. My suggestion is, just like you're doing right now, is get one thing really underway. And it appears that you may be downtown. And once you get that underway, and that is, by underway, I mean have a plan for how you're going to deal with it, and you'll see what that plan might look like. And then the staff has some time to work on that and get back to you. Meantime, you can, once you get that underway and you see where your time management's going to go on those areas, you can say, okay, let's add the next thing. And then you get the second thing on, you can add the third thing. I will tell you, very few high-performing boards really manage more than 3 effectively. I mean, it's just very difficult because you've got so much else going on. But just take one at a time, get it going.
So when we look at this list and the way that it's prioritized now, it's not actually prioritized according to the way our financial obligations may be. And that could be with the why, or the fact that, your other screen.
Yeah.
The why.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
Or the YMCA, because we do have a financial obligation there that's going to be coming up. Our other obligation that's coming up is going to be the fact that our town hall, we have to really do something this year, or even with Public Works. So when we're looking at priorities and getting something in order, are we looking at it according to the 533, or are we looking at it according to what our financial obligations are, or what's coming up as a real priority that we have to address at this time? Because if that's the case, then it's not according to the way that it's itemized.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I don't know that I have a perfect answer to this, but I will say this, that what you should be talking about is what you want to do as a board, what you want to be dedicating your time to. That doesn't mean you don't want to get the other things done. That doesn't mean you don't want to fulfill your ministerial obligation. That doesn't mean you want to walk away from your YMCA partnership. It does mean that you want to be intentional about where you invest your time. That's what it means. And so this is an indication to staff that the YMCA, you still have to fulfill that, but it's going to be their job to figure out how to fit that in and not take as much time. So what I see in this, and this happens in communities, sometimes very well-intentioned staff, but, you know, you'll have something that comes up, one of these issues that comes up, and all of a sudden you've got a half of a day session scheduled on something that is not a high priority for you. And when staff sees that that's coming up, they're going to have a discussion with you and say, how do you want to handle this? You know, and sometimes that means having a advisory committee help you do some more of that work. Sometimes it means staff giving some more direction to them so that they're investing more time in that instead of you investing something that's a lower priority. So there's other techniques. I mean, again, the advantage you have is you have an experienced staff here, and Greg's very experienced, so he'll understand that. Now, I will tell you right now, Greg will probably never make a mistake, but I did as a manager. I made plenty of mistakes in those areas, but I had a good enough relationship. Even at Central Line, I would run into this problem. But I had a good enough board that they'd say, pull back a little, Jim. We want to spend more time on this. You know, I'd report to them what we're doing, but they'd say, pull back, and that's okay. You know, they knew that there wasn't any intended harm. It was just that I was running with something, and they wanted to spend a little more time on it, and that's okay. So we would try to keep you informed about that. But that's part of that, balancing that out. Assume good intent, but communicate. But communicate when you're not pleased with how things are going. Again, professional staff aren't going to take it personal. You aren't going to make it personal. They aren't going to take it personal. That's just the way it is. I mean, it's just business. You know, from that perspective, we're not going to do everything perfect.
When I look at this list, I'm happy with the downtown transportation plan and parks. I think that the downtown, we have a financial obligation already of $500,000 with the TAP grant that we're matching. And those things are going to happen. It's on the table as far as what we do with the corner lot, the decisions with the corner lot, that could possibly be a solution, as Greg said, for renting the upstairs for town hall, if that's a possibility. So, and also selling the building, whether to sell it or not. And then the transportation plan, I'm looking at, a lot of that depends on the DOT and not us in all of the things that are going to be coming down the road for the next 5 or 6 years. As far as parks, we've spent an awful lot of money and an extremely large amount of time, staff time, on the parks plan. And I think it's time to really look at this and make sure we allocate money toward a park or more. I'm happy with the 3 to work on those 3. As far as the facilities and town hall, public works, it's pretty obvious that we're going to have to look at perhaps borrowing money if we do town hall. There's no other way to do a town hall if we build one and buy the land without borrowing, correct? So,
We need to have a discussion now or at some future point on what all of the options are for the town hall as our lease comes due, such as renewing the lease, leasing someplace else, purchasing, but even if we decide to purchase, it won't happen right away. We have to have someplace to go in the meantime. So do we need to tackle that today, or is that for a later discussion?
By the way, that's a perfect example of the information that you want from staff. And I don't want to speak for staff, but I'd be surprised that they're ready to talk about that today. But what you've just identified is clarity regarding what information you're going to want. What are the different options? And then what they will do is say, here's what we think the options are. But again, if you don't see an option there that you think should have been evaluated and or should be evaluated, it isn't included, just say that. Just say we want it, because it's what slows progress down is, and what erodes trust with the public, quite frankly, is when you don't evaluate an option that they think or you think should have been evaluated, and you get to the end And staff understandably can say, and this would happen to me, that you get to the end of a decision process, and a option that was obvious to a lot of people except maybe staff or consultant didn't get evaluated, and then you make a decision, people say, well, you didn't evaluate this. And if you throw it in later, they say, well, you really didn't seriously consider it. So that's where your judgment comes into play. And I'll tell a quick story about that. We did that. Cedar Rapids had a really bad flood. You've heard me say this before. And when we had to look at different options for rebuilding after the flood, we ended up evaluating, not rebuilding, flood management system. I think like 17 different options with the Army Corps of Engineers. It was really expensive to do that, but we felt it was very important to have everyone out there, every different option that was potentially even people thought were viable. And that saved us time later on. It hurt us in the front end, but it helped us later on. So that's where you come into play. You come into play and say, here's the options we want, here's the information we want to evaluate each option, that is the criteria. And then when you get it, you can say, yeah, this looks complete, or no, I don't think this, I have some questions or concerns about how that option was evaluated. And so what you're doing is you're building public trust when you do that, but you're also building your own confidence in the decision, because you want that to be the best decision. None of these decisions are going to be easy. I will tell you right now, all of them are going to be difficult. So you want to have as much confidence as you can going forward, because you have to defend that to the public, and that's part of your job. So you're going to want to have that good information, and the staff will give it to you.
So I think when you look at that list and keying off of what Commissioner Lee kind of was alluding to, so one of the things I always operated in the private sector, you don't want to surprise a board. You do not want to surprise a board. So when you go through that list, where do we eliminate any potential for surprises, knowing that we can only work on a few? So the why, next board decision is June 2020. So outside of a minor contractual change to get the dates to align, that's in staff's hands. Would we get it? Would we like a report on an occasional basis? Yeah, but we put it in their hands. We trust it. Yes, we know there's a couple $1 million that have to come. They'll bring forward the budget amendment, but the next major board decision is June 2020 with the concept plan. That we know. So that one is really, while there, it's off the table in terms of our time. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, and again, staff's likely done, I haven't talked to Greg in detail on any of these issues, but they've likely done 90% of what they need to do in these areas. But
Yeah.
what you want, what will help them is, as time permits, for them to get in front of you, show their homework.
Absolutely.
Show you exactly what they see. For example, when you have to vote on something in 2020, you're not going to want to see it that night. You're going to want to see it ahead of time. So what's their plan to give you the information you want in bite-sized chunks, so by the time 2020, that vote comes around, you will have satisfied yourself that you've had all the information you need, and including all the options and the evaluation criteria you need, that you would have satisfied yourself. So what's your timeline for doing this? So one of the things that, and I don't want to get too geeky on you here, but one of the things that you will build over the course of time is really a master schedule of all of these different issues and the meetings where you're going to be talking about these. Don't try to build it, because I made that mistake. Don't try to build it now. You build it over the course of time, and it may take 6 months or a year to build that master schedule, and it's going to change a lot. But start with it so you can see what's on the table in terms of looking ahead and what your time commitments are going to be to be able to make those decisions. So you build it one piece at a time. Start with the downtown and go from there.
So then if you just kind of work up, going to the one that Commissioner Lee brought up, Facilities, Town Hall, Public Works, we know the lease is up in November. That's about the only data point we have as a board that we've really discussed. That makes, I can speak individually, that makes me a little bit nervous that we're within 9 months and we don't know anything.
Yeah.
And so, while that was a lower priority in terms of voting to us, to me at least, it kind of elevates that we probably need some homework brought back to say, where are we and what are we facing? Not as a function of the budget, but as a function of just where are we? Because at any time you talk town hall, that's a public discussion as well. Citizens want to be involved in that. And they have a right to be involved in that.
And Greg, have you done research on this that
Yeah, and
you
I think
can
that's-
bring to us?
I think that's kind of what I was gonna indicate that. You know, this issue was raised back in the fall, a year ahead of time, to say that the lease is up in November.
Yeah.
And so the homework that Jim's talking about is something that we do as a matter of routine, that is just part of our job. The other important thing that,
But part of the job is also communicating it to us so we feel comfortable, so when we're out talking, we can reassure people too. I mean, that's part of it, that we're all on the same page. It doesn't help with one talking about one thing, one talking about another, another talking about another. That's where I think we hurt ourselves as a board, because we have to have, we know you're doing the hard work. We gotta do the leadership work where we're all on the same page.
part of the discussing it in the community is having the right information before discussing it in the community. And so while we discussed at the retreat the option that exists for perhaps being a tenant in a new facility, we also need accurate information about what it would look like to stay in the present facility. And we are awaiting that, and we'll get that. But that will be part of a decision packet that will come to the board to look at the existing facility and how long we might be able to be there, other options that might be on the table, what are the timing with those other options, and then really another discussion about whether or not the town ever wants to build and own a facility and what that timing might look like, which is really not a short-term decision.
Do you have an estimate of what month you think you'll be coming to us with the short-term part of that, which is, are we staying or are we going somewhere else
I think we're within a month of that.
Okay, that's good to know.
So,
The key part of that is that your options for actually moving require a lot more logistics than staying in any facility. So we can't, and the good news is that's the part that we've made the most progress on as far as what that could look like.
this is a great example of illustrating the tension between staff wanting to get you complete and current information, and just as you've all identified, your desire to at least get a status report. And so it's useful just to communicate that you understand that the staff may not have all the information necessary, but to provide brief status reports on issues and have interim discussions is going to be useful. Again, the challenge there is going to be balancing how much time you spend getting reports with incomplete information and working on other priorities. So, but there's no right answer to that. It's just, if you think that you need it, let Greg know, and he'll get that to you. And just understand that it may be incomplete, and don't get frustrated, because, well, you can get frustrated, but just understand that frustration is just part of working with the fact that we don't always get information as quickly as we like, or as complete as we'd like.
I think the magic word you used a few minutes ago is a schedule. And, we have, if you look at that list, probably 1,000 parts and pieces that aren't on a general schedule right now. And as Steve said, it's not that we want to be saying, well, move this one here or do that, but we need to have some way that the members of this board can know generally what's going on, when to expect certain things, because when you do interact with the public, that's part of what you need to know. And we don't have that right now. It's getting there. Matt's interactive map, and the fact that you added the development projects to that same kind of thing, that's the kind of steps in the right direction, I think. Once we have a schedule in place, and it's not going to be, 1,000 parts at first, it's going to be 10, then
And I've
20,
heard-
and
I've heard a number of you talk about just that concept of getting things better, not worrying about getting them perfect right away. Just get them better. Let's just change the momentum in terms of where we want to get this information, and understand that you're not going to get complete satisfactory results overnight on any of these issues. Something's always going to come in to interrupt that.
Greg, I have a question. As far as the town hall, I mean, it's obvious we don't have another place to go right now other than the building that you're in. And if there was a building built, that's going to be out 18 months, 2 years. So do you have any idea if this is going to be when they come back a month to month, or if they will give another 2-year lease? Do you have any idea?
So we were expecting a phone call today
Oh,
about that answer, so I don't know yet. I suspect that the existing facility should be fine for whatever short-term need we have. There are other options for us as far as short-term if we had to make a move. But to your point, new construction is going to take until December of 2020 to be complete, to actually have a facility to move into if somebody starts a project in the near future.
okay.
But we're not at a decision point where the board will be forced to make any kind of decision under the gun. We've got adequate time to do that. But it does, we do need some answers fairly soon as far as what those options are. Again, the longer term discussion about a permanent facility that the town might own, we are not teeing that up for you other than to say, we will identify what some of those options could be down the road, but that's not really the short-term decision that this board would be asked to look at. But really, it's two different options. How long can we stay in the current facility, and then if and when is there another option out there that would come available?
Greg, do we have some timeline on when we're going to go through, and maybe part of this is today, but the ULI, like a decision about Niven Price?
Yeah, so the second half of today is really focused on the downtown and a deep dive into some of the decision-making aspects of what does downtown mean? And until there's some fleshing out of what that means for the board, and the board is on the same page, we really won't be able to provide a schedule for those different parts. Once we talk about what does downtown mean, is it redevelopment or the sale of a single building? That is one of those potential goals that can come out of that downtown discussion, but what else could it include? And then we can put a schedule to that. Jim's going to caution you very clearly about what he said to start this is nothing in the redevelopment world ends up where it starts.
Of course.
But we can begin to flesh out what schedules look like for those different pieces. We're already moving down the path toward the short-term goal of how do you enhance parking around that downtown area. So we can talk about that a little bit more in the second half today, but that certainly is something we would be interested in hearing more about, what that downtown statement means.
By the way, what's really useful as we go through all of this stuff, if you don't already do this, keep a journal somehow of the types of questions, concerns, just like you talked about today, that you have. And make sure that that they do get addressed, that you find a place, a home, that will get addressed at some point in time. Because remember, you're elected because people trust your judgment, and that's got to come into play here. And it's real easy, this probably never happens to you, but it happens to me, that I'll think of something and then forget about it, and then when it's later on in the process, if you haven't journaled that, if you haven't recorded it, and it comes to be a problem, you kick yourself because you say, oh, I thought of that, but I didn't follow up to make sure it gets addressed. And collectively, you should make really good decisions when you have a board that has diverse views on issues. We got to make sure all those concerns get surfaced. So other comments or questions about, so here's what I'm going to feed back to you, and again, I expect you to refine this and make sure that I got it right, but what I hear, first of all, is people are generally okay with the goals. Again, they are really placemakers for goals, because you have to refine more specific goal statements. So there are areas of goals that you want to address. Two, that you're really interested in not having goals, but getting things done. And you want to make sure that you see the process for doing that. Three, there's concern about how do you manage the priorities that you've established here, and that's what they really are, maybe better said as priorities as opposed to goals. They're priorities. You want to manage that, but you also know that you have some other obligations. And you want to understand how you manage both of those, and we talked a little bit about how that can be done. But overall, there seems to be an agreement that these are the priorities, and let's rename this, not goals, but priorities, areas of priorities. Is that a fair statement? Did I misstatement anything? Anything else that, are we ready to go into the second part of this discussion? So if you are, we can use this as an example, and I apologize for not getting more into this at the goal at the retreat, but let's move into we talked about this, right? So systems to implement. Do we have any more? So we have another one on the.
There's a couple different slide sets for the downtown discussion, and we can get those loaded up.
Yeah, let's get
There's
those loaded up.
Minute or two break.
Take 5 and come back at 3:15.
Take a break. Thank you.
So, sure, before we jump into the discussion more in depth from Jim, I'm just going to provide a little bit more context, background information, and just throw out some questions the board might want to ponder as we start talking about the Niven Price building. So that's 216 West North Main Street. That is the Niven Price property. And these are just some facts. And I'm happy to send this out to folks and provide it, obviously more detail if you would like, but just thought these are some of the most salient features, about 9,500 square feet, and that includes, a lot of people in the community I've found don't realize that when we say the Niven Price building, we're talking about from left to right, where Noma Salon is, to the middle, a two-story piece, and then on the right, there's the one-story section again. So that is what we mean when we say the Niven Price building. It's actually three distinct buildings separated by firewalls, brick, but it functions as historically as one piece. So the appraisal that was done recently, not including the parking lot, so this was just the building, and the land that the building actually sits on is 1.25 million. Currently, it is 100% leased. As we know, it's not very difficult to keep things leased in the downtown. There's a lot of demand for that, but the town has allowed that building to be leased currently at below market rent. Downtown, we see anywhere from, it varies wildly, but everywhere from about $12 a square foot up to $23, $24 at the mill, for example. So pretty wide range there, but right now in the Niven Price building, we have everything from probably $6 to somewhere around $12. And a market rate, according to the appraisal, you could get about $13 per square foot, and that would take what the gross rent right now is being received up to about $127, $179 is the estimate there. So not quite double, but but close to it. And then so that's a fairly significant spread there in between what's current and then what could potentially be realized by someone else. Could be the town, could be a private party. So the assessor valued the valuation at $632, but what you see here when I take this clip from the appraisal document, there you see $272, and so currently the building is not an historic landmark. If the town has several historic landmarks downtown, the Women's Club building, for example, the Coconuts building, which is the Antiques Mart, all the way down to where Stella and Parker is, the overhead bridge, the water tower. But currently the Niven Price building is not, and so if someone wanted to take that building and make the necessary improvements and get that certification, there could be a 50% tax abatement, which factored into the appraisal value. So that could be something that anyone looking at this building for redevelopment would want to consider. Another big consideration for this building is that it is already on the National Register of Historic Places, which makes it eligible for historic federal and state historic tax credits. So what that means is that if you were to do qualified rehabilitation expenses, and qualified means that they would have to be done to the standards of the Secretary and of the Interior, which are very similar to Waxhaw's historic criteria, then that would make it eligible for tax credits on the value of those expenses. So just an example here, if you had $1 million of eligible expenses and you combine the federal and the state piggybacks on the federal, so it's contingent on you getting the federal, that's the kind of tax credit. So these are just things that are helpful to know. Of course, this is if it were going to be done by a private developer, but just thought it'd be helpful to keep that in mind, and this is something that certainly I think anyone who was interested in the building would be thinking about. And just anecdotally, as people have definitely taken a look at the ULI study now that we've put that out there and it's on the website, and I get a lot of phone calls, and just these are questions that come up frequently. Is it eligible for tax credits? It's something that is definitely developers are interested in. This is just an interior survey of the building, kind of rudimentary here, but this is as it currently is. Unit 1, this is where the artist studios are. The middle unit is the open space in the middle that's used by a variety of business incubations right now. And then the left here is where the salon is. On top, what we call Unit 4. This is the second story, and that's how it's currently laid out. But this is just the current layout. I don't think any of this, the majority of the walls you see here, for example, where it says lounge or where these suites are concerned, they're not structural. These are just kind of drywall situations. So it's flexible, is what I'm getting at. Is if the interior of the space is flexible. This is the current facade, and this is an historic photo of it. I think that's pretty cool. So you see that it's a little bit different here. You've got still the recessed entryways, the retail style windows, so that you can see inside really well. This is a historic. This is a rendition done by, I believe, Ron Zimmerman actually did this several years back of what it may have looked like in 1913, 1914 when it was first constructed. So certainly the Secretary of the Interior would be taking this kind of stuff into account with regard to qualification for tax credits. This is something that the North Carolina Main Street actually had a design services person a couple years ago who did this for us. The reason that it is, the building's not actually separated like this, don't worry, it's still in good condition, but the reason it looks like this is because this was actually hand-drawn by a designer, and she drew each individual building one at a time, and I wasn't able to splice them together. But this is just a rendition she did to show what it could look like if it were restored, to try to make it look like its original facade. So when we talk about yes?
I have a question. Are these three buildings, are they independent of each other as far as they could structurally, there's bathrooms in each one, there's electricity, water for each unit?
Right.
It's not all connected?
It's not, right, it's not all connected, no. So when we talk about, we keep throwing this phrase out, ULI throws it out a lot, and then in the report it's mentioned this highest and best use. I just thought I would highlight when we're talking about highest and best use, we're saying what's physically possible. So Commissioner Burns, to your point to your question about the building, how it's currently laid out, how it's structured, what's physically possible with the space, what's legally permissible, so with the zoning district that it's in, for example, what's financially feasible, and what's maximally productive. That's what we're talking about at least when I think internally when we're using the term highest and best use. Wanted to just take this clip from the appraisal. Look at the Integra Realty Resources said that continuing to use the building as retail and office is going to be the maximally productive highest and best use for the property. Because to continue to use it in a retail / restaurant is included, or office use, and not necessarily we've gotten questions about what about residential on the second floor, for example, just because of the square footage and what it would take to do the necessary rehab. They still consider retail and office to be the most feasible and the maximally productive use. This is just a clip I took from, we were reviewing a lot of different RFPs from other towns throughout the state, and this is an interesting quote I took from one, and something for the board to, I think, to consider. Because I've gotten everything. I get phone calls from everything from someone who calls and says, I want to buy the building, I'll give you X amount of money. How can I go ahead and buy it? Can't you just sell it to me? So you got people looking at it like a pure real estate transaction. And then I think, as Jim will talk about in a few minutes, on the other end of the spectrum is looking at it more of a how can you use this property to leverage to help meet a downtown goal, a broader vision that the town might have. So that's why I put that quote up there, because the Reedsville RFP, and we've looked at a lot of other ones as well, but kind of have this theme running through it, that it's, for most towns, it's not really a pure real estate transaction, but it's usually part of a broader vision. So that's just something that I thought you might want to consider as we go forward. And I think this is just about wrapping up here, but some of the questions that you might want to ask if the board does move towards wanting to sell the building or divest of this property and others around perhaps. But first of all, what's the project area? Are we talking about just the building? We had it appraised without the parking lot because of the importance. I think there was a consensus that the parking lot is key to maintain that public asset. But are you talking about the sidewalks? Project area doesn't have to include just the building. It can include the sidewalks nearby. It could include other town-owned parcels. That we've got several town-owned parcels that are pretty much adjacent if you just cross the street, cross Church Street, with McDonald House and the water tower and the community corner. So what's the project area? What's the town's financial or other contribution going to look like? I think that you're going to get, the ULI suggested, one of their recommendations was that the town go ahead and rehab that facade to make it look like the pictures that I showed you in this presentation. But, you're going to get that question most likely from anyone interested in the building is what's the town's piece in this going to be? When I talk about first right of refusal for the town, there's, and this may be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but in the event that you were to sell the building, and then the developer didn't meet the terms of an agreement, does the town have the ability to kind of claw that building back? Is that something that should be taken into account? What are your evaluation criteria when you're gonna consider a development partner? If you're gonna consider a development partner, how are you gonna evaluate them? Is it just their financial capability? Is it their buy-in to your vision? Is it any number of evaluation criteria that might be important, and how do you rank those? How does your existing advisory board add value to this process? You'll see next week as you go to the Main Street Advisory or the Main Street Conference, many of you, that there's been a lot of research done already about this kind of project, and you can certainly. I think that the advisory board would be eager to help and add value to that process. Some example, I guess I mentioned a couple, but what kind of design standards might you require? You can put historic covenants on property. You can require, so that requires the property to be maintained in a certain manner, but you can also add a rehabilitation agreement on top of that where you require specific types of work from a potential developer. Think of anything else is not immediately obvious there. Sorry, uses. There's examples throughout the state that I've researched that they're calling out specific uses that they want. There's towns that say, we need a restaurant, not just retail, but the type of retail. So I think that's certainly pretty interesting, and something that the board may want to consider. Are you looking to leverage what's already happening downtown? Downtown is really known right now, I think, more and more regionally for being a place where Union County goes to eat, and it has a really strong restaurant environment. So are you looking to build on what's already there, or are you looking to fill gaps in the existing business mix? So these are all things that I think will be important questions to ask as we go through that process, if indeed we move towards a sale of the building.
Are you going to be able to explain to us more about what we legally can do? Not just, you mentioned a lot of things like calling out the type of use and things like that, but I don't think all of us know what our options legally would be to put into a contract or a partnership deal.
I think that and the answer is yes. And one of the really smart things that you're doing here is you've got your attorney here as you're talking about this community. So there's a lot of flexibility in that area. And the good news is you don't have to. I'm going to discourage you from wanting to answer any of those questions right now. But we do have to get answers to them, but we just don't have to get them right now. So yes, you will be guided in what you can and can't do, but there's a lot of flexibility, and we'll talk about what that flexibility, how that flexibility can be exercised.
These are all good questions. What do you think is the time frame before bringing them back? If we're not going to talk about them today, when are we going to talk about them?
Well, let me get into my presentation, if that's okay. We can get into it. So we load up the other presentation. So very quickly, in the 1990s, a lot of communities, especially in the Chicago area, began to do the type of read-it-all we're talking about here. And they ran into a lot of problems. And the problems were financial, they were legal, they were political problems. And so we were asked, when I was at Independent Public Finance Firm, and we were asked to research and figure out what the problems were and how to avoid them going forward. So what we came up with was this process that we use to read it all. And as I said before, not every community does it exactly the same. They're different, and they're different mostly because your needs and your interests are different. But we'll walk through this, and hopefully it'll answer a lot of the questions that you have. So the keys to the successful development, and this is really important to start with and end with, is you need to have clearly defined goals. You don't have to have them right away to begin with. You're gonna refine those goals over the course of times, but by the time you make your decision on an agreement with the developer, you're gonna wanna know those goals, and you're gonna have to have really clear agreement on those. You're gonna wanna have community support. And that's really important, and it's neighborhood support and community support, because your downtown is the signature of your community, and you're messing around with history, you're messing around with what people think is vital. You need to make sure that the public has an opportunity to see what's going on and give you feedback. You will not ever get full agreement as to what you should do. That's not going to happen. But you will have the opportunity to hear what the questions or concerns might be. It's going to have to be market feasible. Again, we saw problems in every one of these areas when we did our research, but market feasibility, and what's really interesting about this, and I didn't understand it because I worked in the public sector such a long time, but you can be like 90% market feasible. I mean, you can really have something that really, there's strong market demand for 90% of it, but that last 10%, not so much. And that last 10% is the difference between success and failure, both financially, but also politically. Because if there's a dark storefront, if there's something you can't get occupied as part of something that the city's been involved with, and you participate in some way, you're seen as the failure there. And even though it's 90% successful, so it's got to be market feasible. It's got to be financially feasible, and obviously market feasible ties into financial feasibility, but you got to make the numbers work, and that's where we came in. I mean, we insisted on every development we helped a community out with having an independent public finance advisor, and we're doing, or I should say, Central Ina is helping out in some communities, but we use an independent public finance advisor to independently review the information, the financial pro forma, and to work through that. And that's important because it gives you another set of eyes, because these are public funds in one way or another. And you want to have somebody else independently determine that whatever assistance you're providing or not providing is appropriate. And then you want an experienced development partner. And I say that because that's really critical. You're really selecting a developer, not a development, because somebody needs to know how to do this. You're getting calls already from people, and I'll guarantee you some of those people are really well qualified. Some of those people are not going to be as well qualified. And their intentions can be very good, and they can have, sometimes they can even be financially very sound, but if they haven't done this before, they're going to have to learn on your time and on your dime, and that's going to be a problem, because time is important in this project. So those are the keys. So here's some sample initial goals: ignite interest in downtown, in redeveloping downtown, and establishing your signature downtown, introduce different types of development. Curt talked about some of those. Those are important, and you're going to start with some very general goals, but we're going to talk later about how you're going to get those goals informed by both the public engagement process, by listening to what the investors in your current investors in the downtown see, your community sees, but also what developers see as potential and as possibility. So you want that to be absorbed, to be absorbed by you, and for you to come back and refine those goals over the course of time. And we'll talk very specifically about how to do that in a very systematic way. So community support. So vigorous public engagement is really important. I think you've seen some of that. What we've done before is we really strongly recommend a three-point process to engage the public. First is provide these are all done with open houses supported by social media, but you invite the public probably into that space if you can, but you give them some pictures of what's there now, what was there in the past. You provide some chronological history about what's going on, but you also talk about, here's some sample goals, maybe even here's some developments from other communities that you think may be attractive, or some uses, but you provide information that will help them respond to three feedback questions. What questions or concerns do they have about what you're doing? How can you communicate more effective about it? And finally, what do they want to tell you about what they want in their downtown? So it's a general, but it's very, very important. You want to know what they're worried about. You want to know what they would like to see. And you want to know how you can communicate with them more effectively. The second time around, you're going to probably want to show them later on in the process what are some different options based upon what you've seen, and get some feedback. And then when you decide that you're going to go with a specific type of development, and it's usually much later on, you're going to want to get their feedback on that as well. So it's got to be vigorous. You have to have a very clearly defined communications plan. You're very good at that. I think you guys beat yourself up a little bit on it, but you're very good at doing that. It's got to be a transparent process, which means showing all the downsides. There's going to be some downsides. The one thing I'll tell you right now, there's never going to be enough parking in a successful downtown. There just isn't. But you have to anticipate doing as best you can to address that issue. And you're going to want to use the balanced decision process. So, yep, sure.
Did you get a sense at the retreat that the board was interested in going forward with the sale of this property, or exploring the sale of this property?
Yeah, my only takeaway from that was there was interest in leveraging that in some way, either for the revenue or otherwise. And my view is, don't let that worry about it.
What my point is going to be this, that then it was successful. In other words, by expressing that, whatever form it came out in, it generated what's going on today.
Yeah.
So we're already at a next level of information.
Well, I'll tell you right now, the hardest part about any of this is just getting it going. But once you get it going, there's still a lot of hard work to do, but a lot of times the communities, for a lot of different reasons, don't get going. Now, we're going to talk about that in terms of the scope later on. Thank you for interrupting me, because I can get on a roll and I inhibit discussion. So, any other questions? So the public engagement process, we've talked about that. The public just needs to see what's going on, and more than anything, they need to let you know what they're worried about, so you can absorb that into the process. And they need to see that there's nothing that's going to happen here that's going to be a perfect solution. And I will tell you again, you're going to have some disadvantages to downtown development. It's going to be parking. It's also going to be someone's going to come along. I guarantee you, after you find that development, someone's going to come along and say, I could have done better than that. I could have done it better, faster, cheaper. And they're going to do all that. So you just have to recognize that and try to stay ahead of that as best you can. So the town board input and approval, there's going to be several steps that are critical for you to be not just involved with. These are where your moments of truth are. First of all, if we get into that our request for qualification or proposal, finalizing that, you're going to need to sign off on that. We want you to take a look if there's open house. you should take a look at what's gonna be out there, so at least you know ahead of time what's the public's gonna see. You're gonna select the developer. Don't ask your staff to select a developer, don't ask your consultant to select a developer. I can't tell you how many times we've been asked to select a developer. You should know who's best here. We're paying you, you should do this. And no, you select it, because that developer, this is a relationship-based activity. It is not a transaction. It is not a sale of a piece of property. If you really want to redevelop, this is not a sale of a part, this is a partnership to help you achieve what you want. And we also suggest 2 phases to development agreements. First is entering into what we call a preliminary development agreement, and that is an agreement to see if you can agree with the developer. So during that period of time, all you're saying is, we are going to agree to work with you. We're going to put it into certain milestones for you to achieve during this process, and then we'll see if there's an agreement. During that time, and again, subject to your attorney's review and really your attorney's help with how we draft that, what we want to do is provide really an exclusive rights period for that developer, because no developer wants to spend a lot of their time and money, and then at the end, you, city council or town board say, oh, we're going to have to give this to somebody else. So there's different ways to do that. Typically, what we end up with is something like a right of first refusal, so that if somebody does come in during this process with a much better idea and a much better plan, you should at least offer that developer that you selected that opportunity to match that. That doesn't tend to be an issue. We don't tend to see another developer coming in play, but you've got to maneuver that issue, and it's challenging to do that, and it's important that you do that. The final development agreement, by the time you reach that final development agreement using this process, everything's pretty well taken care of. All you're doing by that point in time is you're getting everything in place, so you've got the property transfer, you know what they're going to build, you've got these assurances that Commissioner Lee, or did you bring that up, that they're going to build. You're going to see that their financing is in place. You're going to have everything in place. Now, that doesn't mean stuff still can't happen, but it rarely does. I mean, by that point in time, everything's pretty well lined up. We've done a review of the financial feasibility review. We've done the market feasibility review. We've got everything in place. They've got their financing in place. And so then you're just getting to closing is what you're doing. So that's during that process. So you're heavily involved. And by the way, when we do, and I think we'll talk about this later. So the market feasibility, we're going to look at market data, but one of the most important things that you're going to do, and we'd encourage the elected officials to be involved with this, one of the most efficient and least costly means to really get some good input is to find developers who've done things in communities that you think are pretty exciting, and call them up and say, we'd like to show you something in our community. Now, your staff can prepare this, but you provide some background, just like Curt did, some background information about the community, about the opportunity. You want them to actually look not just at that parcel. What we'd encourage you to do is look bigger, show them the other areas, and then invite them in for the opportunity to talk to you. And you may have some other folks involved, but you're going to have, typically ends up to be about an hour and a half to 2 hour meeting with them, and they're going to tour the town ahead of time, usually on their own. But you're just going to ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves, and then you're just going to ask them, what do they see as opportunities here? What do they see barriers to getting this completed? And that's also where you can sometimes get some discussion about, are there some public improvements that'll be needed? Are there some, in one community, we had a really attractive redevelopment opportunity, but it was right next to a really unattractive area, and so we had to talk about what are we going to do to address that unattractive area. Sometimes it is about public improvement, sometimes it's about parking, sometimes it's about developing amenity or highlighting an amenity to help increase the marketability for different types of uses. So you're gonna ask them. Now, we try to set up at least 3 or 4 of those types of sessions where you can get that feedback. But that feedback helps inform what your ultimate goals would be. That and your public engagement will help inform your goals. So you can wait on a lot of this until you get that type of input in. You've already done the ULI, and that may be sufficient from this purpose. I think the other reason you want to do this, however, is you also use that as an opportunity to market to those developers who you really have interest in. And that will also tell you, if you have trouble, if you're having trouble, and I don't think you will, but if you're having trouble getting developers here, you got to ask why. Why aren't they coming here to take a look and talk to you about this? You want to find that out and solve for that problem. And use that to help inform what you're going to do later on. So you take that information, financial feasibility, so we recommend you prepare a development pro forma. We have a pretty standard approach we use on that. Again, we don't do that work directly, Ellers does, but there may be other independent public finance advisors that know how to do this that you can work with on that. It's really inexpensive. I think for the 3 communities that are using this now, Bessemer City, Statesville had used it, Salisbury had used it, and I think one other community, I don't think anybody spent more than $2,500, so it's not real expensive to do that. It's really about looking at project uses, land acquisition, public improvements, and public improvements are typically an important part of this, even if it's just sidewalks, but a lot of times it's sidewalks, parking, sometimes it's streetscape, because you want to use this as an opportunity to really build on and help stimulate your downtown. The other part of this, and this gets to be a little arcane, so if I don't explain it well, let me know. But a lot of times, when you put in public improvements in the downtown area, you're increasing the basis of the value for everybody in that downtown. Now when you want to do additional redevelopment downtown, you've got a higher basis. So the people that have benefited from those public improvements, those owners, now when they go sell their property for redevelopment, now it's more expensive to redevelop it. So you really need to take a look at, are there some options for us to help manage that more effectively? And there are some, and we can talk about what they are. That's going to be important because you're going to want to stimulate this. You're not going to want to make it more expensive for the town to redevelop more of your downtown if that's what you want to do. You're going to have to identify a gap, if any. In most times when you want the goals you want to achieve, there's going to be a gap, and you want to identify what the gap is and how you're going to close it. So sometimes, and Kurt's talked about this, the historic tax credits can close that gap. There's other ways to close that gap, and that's important. And then you review options to close the gap. Development partner. So you're looking with a developer partner. You're going to assess their capability with similar projects. You're going to review their ability to develop effective relationships with stakeholders. So a lot of times you do end up finding that it will be beneficial to develop additional parcels, and their ability to work with other existing property owners is really important, but also the neighbors and the existing businesses and the community as a whole. They should know how to work with those stakeholders. They should have, if you're going to use historic tax credits, they should know how to do that, and they should know the people that at CHIP, the State Historic Preservation Office, they should know how to do that. And then we want to review their financial capability. So we take a look at 2 things. Number one, can they access equity? And I will tell you more often than not, that's where you run into a problem. They don't have the ability to access, good intentions, but they can't get equity. And that's the money they have to put into this. That's not what they're borrowing. That's the equity that they got to put in. And you're going to want to know that they have access to that, or at least know whether they can. You can decide, and I have had some communities some elected boards really like a developer, so they select someone who didn't have a lot of equity, and that we still got the development done. It just took longer, and it was a little more expensive when they don't have equity. And then we have to know that their lending partners are willing to lend for the types of project you're looking for. They have to have experience doing that. If they have established banking relationships, again, the difference is, we worked with one developer one time when I called the banker up, and I said, the project would be about $50 million, and it would be this type of uses in there. They'd say, this was a major bank, it was U.S. Bank, we'll take all of the project loan that this developer can present to us. He's solid, we're working. Somebody else says, well, we're pretty cautious, with a developer for that type of, or we've never loaned that developer on something like that. So we give you that information, or your staff can give you that information, so you have it. And you use that as part of your selection process. So the development steps, so that's kind of background. So the first step was approve a development process, which just outlines these steps. Affirm your preliminary development goals. Design a public engagement process, including your communications plan. Assess your market and financial feasibility, and you can do that. You've already done that really with ULI, but you might want to add into that some developer interviews. You want to review the feedback and affirm the RFQ or RFP, and then you want to conduct a pre-submittal conference call or meeting with developers, see if they have any questions. Review and evaluate the submissions, and then it's the elected officials who's elected developer. So we recommend that you decide the top 3 or so, bring them in for a public session, ask them some questions. They should be able to do a presentation. Now, we don't suggest you do a RFP because your best developers are really, really busy, and they just simply will not submit in most cases. There may be a few, but most of them will not submit. They'll submit their qualifications, and even then, sometimes you got to twist their arm a little bit because, they're busy. But you're asking them for pretty basic stuff, banking references, some community references. You can typically get them to do that. But you select the developer. We suggest those interviews. We suggest you sleep on it and then select the developer. And then we your staff initiates with your attorney a preliminary development agreement, which actually takes longer to negotiate than you may think. But you get a preliminary development agreement, which is, again, just an agreement to see if we can agree. It doesn't commit you to anything except give that developer an exclusive rights for a period of time, kind of a quasi-exclusive rights for a period of time. And then you work, and this is the key, I was mentioning to your attorney, the key is having bi-weekly meetings with that developer, most of the time over the phone, just kind of walking through all the different steps that they need to go through to evaluate what they want to do, what's the market potential, and I will tell you, our experience is that never takes less than a year. It never takes less than a year. It's at least a year to go through that process and then begin to work up with a final plan, bring it back to you. You're going to take a look at what they're proposing. You're going to say, yes, we like that, we don't like that. They'll rework it and get back to you, and then put together, once you have a plan that seems to work, then they'll begin to line up financing. Financing is kind of their last step to move along. There may be some land entitlement issues, that has to be worked out in the middle of that as well. Start construction and ribbon cutting. So, and construction on most of these, again, they're typically, especially if they're historic preservation, you're a year. And there's been, lately in the state, there's been a slowdown in how quickly you can get through historic SHPO review. So you're looking at two years. This takes time. And it's a very tedious process. But you're most likely to achieve success using this terms. Now, the option is, and there's, as I said, there's no one right or wrong way. You may just say, you know what, we're just going to sell it, and that's up to you. But you give up a lot of control. The reason why people typically don't just sell it outright is control, is to help influence and shape what you want to see done. You won't always maximize the immediate value of your get using this process as well. You typically will get a longer, and you can design it so you can get a longer-term positive impact, because you're going to want to have a development that helps promote other types of development. And in fact, that's one of the questions you're going to want to ask developers, is what do they see as potential? And you saw some of that in the ULI report as well. So I think, so roles, it's just again, you're custodians and final approval of the process. So that's really key. Do not be a champion of a developer or a development. Right now, you're a champion of the development process. Your final approval of the public engagement, final approval of goals, review and final approval of the RFQ or RFP, and final review and approval of the developer staff. It's they help prepare and refine that process for your review. Public engagement, they conduct the public engagement, they review the market and financial feasibility, they prepare market and financial feasibility report, working with consultants there, draft RFP, RFQ, RFP, and evaluate developer capability. And public, they need to be engaged, communicate their concerns, and encourage others to be engaged. So that's it. Again, it's not a simple process, but using this process, we find that we get some really good results. Communities have used this, and I worked with about 50 communities that have used this process in some form or another. We've had redevelopment completed in all but 2 communities as a result of this. So questions, comments, concerns?
Everybody wants 5 minutes, and then we'll come back with questions.
Sure.
Hard to get out of that?
Pardon?
Is it hard to get out of that?
At my age, yes. I look around and I realize I'm probably the oldest person here, so.
Probably not.
Well, that's all I had. Now it's the time to respond to any questions or concerns or worries you may have. What didn't make sense about what I talked about?
I think it all made sense. And like I said just a couple of minutes ago, if you took away from the first retreat the sense that the board wanted to investigate this, and it was that simple to get you to come back and have this presentation, that's a really interesting experience.
I'd like to know what Greg needs from us next. What can we do for Greg?
I think one thing that'd be valuable is for Charlie to kind of go back over what the legal process is, because there's really only two ways to sell property. I think just kind of going back through that might be 10 minutes, 15 minutes of the options that are out there.
With the pleasure of the board, I'll be glad to. Your options are limited on selling property, of course. Real property particularly. Fundamentally, there's only two ways to do it. Through a private negotiation with an upset bid process built into it. So you don't necessarily know who you're going to sell the property to. You have no control. I think the key word that he used was control throughout all of this. And this is major to Waxhaw, so you want to maintain control. The other way to sell property is through an auction process. Well, neither one of those are very exciting for a downtown development project. The statutes provide you with one alternative to that, and that is a, quote, downtown development project. The nifty thing, and that's what he's talking about, the nifty thing about that is you have complete control during the process. You, first of all, would want to design the project in your minds. You'll put it on a piece of paper with a developer, but what is it you want to do? One of the things about the development process is it is a public-private partnership. So I would not look at this time to divide the parking and the building. You're going to have to bundle those together. Develop your project boundaries. You want to think about the project boundaries. And that's to maintain control, because you're going to want to, as a part of this, record in the Register of Deeds a downtown development plat, so that no matter what, in perpetuity, the area within that boundary is going to have to comply with all of the requirements and all the reciprocal easements and everything else that goes along with that to any future purchaser of any of this property that you sell to a private developer. So that if he sells it, that other person would have to come along and maintain the integrity of that project. But you want to give him a carrot also, because it is a public-private development. He's going to want to know that for his investment, he's going to get the public infrastructure. So one of the ways to do that is, in the development agreement, you let them build that public infrastructure. You pay for it, but he builds it, he or she builds it, as well as develops the building that you want to sell. The nifty thing is, you can sell it to that developer by private negotiation, which the agreement will do. The development agreement will do that. You don't have to put it out for upset bids. You don't have to put it out for public auction. You can sell it directly to that developer. He gets good title. So in your project, you want to make sure that that building is built to the standards and specifications that you want downtown Waxhaw to look like, and the uses that you want it. So you want to make sure that your zoning is already in place, that whatever that development is, zoning will allow that. That's a part of the initial development agreement, that it's going to be compliant with governmental regulations. You want to record your plat of the entire boundary of the project. So now you still have control over the project. You still have control over what is the public participation and what is the private participation. But the private guy, he's wanting to make sure that he gets the public infrastructure, but if it's he that is building it, then he'll build it to your standards, obviously, to the town standards. But he'll have to build it, but he knows he's getting that. He doesn't have to rely on you. If he makes $1.25 million investment, he's going to want to know that your infrastructure will be there contemporaneously with his development, not have to wait on public, sometimes administrative bureaucracy, shall I say. He wants to have it now. So you let him do that. You let him do the whole project. You sell him the building. You get the $1.25 million. You repay him for what we're calling in the project, the public infrastructure. But he's also protected in that everything happens on his timeline and your timeline, because in the agreement, your timelines are going to be the same thing. Mayor.
So, if I'm hearing you right, we could articulate that the public infrastructure is the parking lot, sidewalk.
Sidewalk, yes.
With the facade of the building,
You can define what that
you can
public,
define whatever you want.
that goes back to the control.
And you can guarantee that it stays public
And you can,
parking?
yes. No, it's going to be yours. You're not going to sell him the parking portion of it. That's going to be,
It'll say that in that final development
Yeah.
agreement. It'll
Okay.
spell that out. Even the cost issues, as described,
Mhm.
you can, we've even looked at some financing mechanisms where the developer agrees to be specially assessed, and then you use tax increment to pay for those improvements.
well, you would know, but you will pay him for those public improvements right up front. You'll have the $1.25 million when he buys the property, which it'll be at the very beginning, because he can't start working on the building until it's his.
And that's when you close. That's when everything is done.
And then you convey it to him, but then he sends you a bill for the work on the construction. But see, remember, I don't know what the value of or the cost of the construction would be for the public, but it may be such that it would generate either a informal bid or a formal bid process for a contractor. Well, you don't have to worry about it in a downtown development project. He just builds it. He has his own architect. You get to say in the development agreement who's going to be the architect and who's going to be the general engineer and all those things. You get that discussion with him. But he builds it, but it's your property. It stays your property.
Wait,
You just pay him for the construction.
At the end of this, the parking lot is our property, or the building is our property, or what?
No, the building will be his. The
Okay.
parking lot will be the
So,
town.
this would be a way to say, get the parking lot paved, and then we would pay him for paving.
Correct,
it, and we would
exactly.
Own it, okay.
Exactly. Yeah, and you get to define how much is, what the size of the sidewalk will be, what it looks like. You get to define what the parking lot looks like and all of those things.
Okay.
He builds it to the development plan. See, that's what the development plan will spell out. That's an option, obviously. You can say, we'll go ahead and build it, and then he's gambling that you will build it. But he really wants a little more control over that as well. So that's why you put it all into a public-private development agreement. But the good thing is you get to sell it to that person with that. Now, it calls for a public hearing prior to your sale to him. The only other requirement is that it be based on a current appraisal. But the development, now, the requirements for the town on a development agreement like this is, one, it be in downtown. Two, that it is a public-private partnership. And three, your cost in this is not greater than 50% of the project cost. Well, obviously, if he's giving you $1.25 million, I don't think the parking lot and the sidewalk are going to equal $1.25 million greater. So it gives you that real flexibility. But by defining at the very beginning in your recorded plat, then if during the project he completes it, but in the future he wants to sell that building, whoever comes in still has to comply with the development agreement. If he redoes anything inside the building or on the outside of the building, he's still got to comply with the agreement on what it looks like and the type of uses you want it to be. If you sell it outright, you have no control over that.
Would we need to have the property reappraised with the parking lot as part of it, because the appraisal was
No,
without parking?
no.
And then we would not be able to accept less than the appraisal value, is that what you're saying?
The statute said that you should sell it for the
For the appraisal.
current, and a current appraisal would be something less than a year old.
Okay.
Should or must? Well, what if you run into a situation where you put it, it's just, you're not able to reach an agreement with anyone at the 1.25, for example. Are you,
The statute seems to say that it should be based on a current appraisal for you to sell it to him. That's a protection to the public.
You have to get another appraisal.
Well, yeah, you can still find you can get another appraisal, or he can get one, and then if the two are not close enough, you can get a third. Where you jointly pay for that third one. But that is the thing, that you have some control over this in perpetuity. It's your downtown. Well, it's the citizens' downtown. But you are the government regulators of that downtown, and you want what's in the best interest. You define what's in the general health, safety, and welfare of the community, where your downtown is a fundamental part of the general health, safety, and welfare of the community. That's a legislative decision. That's your decision. So when I say it's your downtown, it's yours to legislatively govern. And also that way, this building that's been tax exempt now suddenly becomes a private property, and suddenly that then becomes, in perpetuity, property subject to ad valorem taxes, which you're missing out on right now. So, I mean, it's just a nifty tool that the General Assembly has given cities. It just has to be in the downtown. You can't spend more than 50% of the project, and it has to be a public-private partnership. But you get to define what that partnership is. So when he says set goals, be thinking of it in those terms. What do we want it to look like? What do we want to be there? And what is the public infrastructure that we're willing to pay for? And the nice thing is, you know where that money's going to come from to pay for it, because he's got to pay you whatever the value of the building is. Did I succinctly? I'm trying to be very succinctly about that. So they want to cumbersome this thing. But the challenge is going to be coming up with a developer where your minds are meeting, and that you put that in writing. And like he says, you can be 90% correct. Most of you have seen the Matthews Station Street in Matthews, where we did the town hall library, and then the private development along the new Matthews Station Street. What no one recognized in 2001 when we did it was that there would be a 2008 financial crisis. The one in Matthews had 6 lots to be sold to the private developer. In other words, he didn't have to take them all down at the same time, meaning he didn't have to buy them all at the same time. So that as he got tenants, he'd buy a plot, pay Matthews, then he'd build another one and pay Matthews, and then he'd pay another, But the last lot to this date has not sold, because in 2008, when he was ready to buy that other lot, he could no longer get credit on raw land. No developer could get credit on raw land. And then it just the economy really hasn't recovered enough. But the critical mass then was not only did the economy, but he also ran out of parking. In 2000, he thought he had plenty of parking. It was so successful, even though only 5 of the 6 were taken down, parking became a problem. So you've got to really anticipate not only what's good for today, but what's going to be good for 15 or 20 years, or even 50 years from now.
Yeah, and again, we can't emphasize enough that you're going to run into like 100 problems before this redevelopment. Just will. That's just the way they go.
Yeah.
And you're just going to have to solve them one at a time. That's one of the reasons we want you to select the developer, because we want to make sure you're comfortable with the developer. But there's just going to be 100 problems. We can't anticipate all of them.
Right.
The best we can to stay ahead of them, and project what the risks are. But there's going to be a lot of problems. It's very, very difficult. If you want to do redevelopment, it's very difficult. There's no doubt about it. And that's why one of the reflections I had was your priorities, again, not your goals, but your priorities, I thought were just intuitively, they were just right on track, because that's important, because it helps establish the signature of your community, but it just takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. It'll have a big impact when you do that, but it's understandable why you'd have that as a top priority. And the the same thing with, with where your recreation, that defines quality of life within a community as well. But it's gonna take a lot of time to figure out what is the phasing for that. How is that all gonna work? You're not gonna do with that. And from what I understand, you very adeptly understood that, well, we're not gonna get this all done at once. It's a matter of figuring out how do we phase this? How do we make this? So you've really done a good job of establishing priorities, just from an outsider's perspective.
So that's what we've done with the Niven Price building. That's phase one of multiple phases. Did I hear you correctly that phase, it's not unrealistic to expect it to be a 2-year
Oh, yeah,
timeframe?
yeah.
Okay.
It's gonna take some time. And what you.
That's just that piece of it.
Well, just that piece, yeah. And remember, what I'm suggesting is, you just open the door. I mean, we want to start the process when you actually do you don't have to pull the trigger on any of, your goals or anything else. You want to wait on that, because you don't need to have that in place until you have the RFQ out there. Then you're going to want to have that in place. But that's why you want to hear from some other folks ahead of time. Do we want to just make it the Niven Price, or do we want to maybe make it a little bigger? You just don't know. Again, I've done.
Your next question.
Yeah.
You open the discussion up.
Yeah, you provide some information. Curt can put some information together, put it on on a protected website, and he starts contacting developers that that you've seen their work in other communities. In fact, I encourage you to think about maybe do a little bus tour sometime. Go to some different communities and take a look and see what they've done and what you like and what you don't like about it, who's done that development. Let your staff know some of those so they can do a little research, because that's your opportunity to market, to contact some of those, to get them to come out and take a look at what you have here. Should you make it just that building? Is now even the right time? They may say, you know what, you need to build up some more population base before we can really market this. I don't know. I just know that what you think you know isn't what you think is so just ain't so sometimes. I mean, it just isn't right, and that's why you want to hear from some other folks before you decide how you want to proceed.
It's critical your vision and the developer's vision be pretty much the same.
Yeah, that's why you're going to
Exactly.
want to really spend a little time, hopefully they come in for, they give you one of those marketing interviews, then they're going to give you that background, and then you're going to interview them. You're going to have some time and talk to them. You're going to have to really say, I trust that person, that developer can get it done for us.
Any perspective on when this phasing becomes too big, you're trying to do too much at once?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that'll come out during that preliminary development phase. You'll be able to see that, because, one of the biggest mistakes we saw in these other communities, and even now, I see some of these communities and developers want to do something too big, and it almost always shows up pretty early in terms of the complexity of putting the project together. So, what's too big for one community may not be too big for another, but we almost always recommend going smaller to begin with. Just get one project done. Don't try to overwhelm. And that's, again, the mistake they made especially in the Chicago area. They try to do some too big, and in a couple of the Minneapolis areas, they try too big a developer. And even in Charlotte, you'll see where they struggle is when they try to take on a really big project. I mean, they may not have any choice, but it's the really big projects that are tough. Get something done, and what you'll see is, the other thing you'll see is, and this is you'll see quality and interest, really increase after that first one. That's the problem that's your prime site right now, and I don't think you have much choice but to go to that one. But your next development's almost always going to be better than that first development. That's just the way it goes.
What's the next step?
Well, the next step is for you to decide that you want to go ahead, and then your staff can put together in a little more detailed timeline what the process would be. But the next step, most likely, is for you to take a look and identify other developments that you've seen in other communities or even here. Just let your staff know what they are, then they can start making some contacts. Curt, Emily has a list, a developer list that we can provide to you as well, so you can make contacts. And then Curt can, I think he's probably got all this already now, but start assembling that, some type of password-protected website where he can refer developers to that and start identifying. I would suggest, and you could give them that ULI report as well, but then just start scheduling some interviews with you and those developers. Come in and just talk to them and just see what you're hearing. And sometimes you hear a lot of consensus. This is what is likely to work real well, and do you think it makes sense and it meets your expectations? Then you can move into the RFQ process, and you'll want to see that. At the same time, as we said, you want to put together, I strongly recommend some type of public engagement process where you're letting the public know what's going on, you're getting some feedback from them before you get too far down the line. But certainly, you'll always hear this is you already had a developer selected before you started this process. Well, you really want to make sure you haven't had a developer selected before you start the process, because they may have some ideas.
So just to be clear, before Curt does anything, like what you just described, the board should take a look around, see what they like, come up with a list of what they like, have a discussion, and then say, this is nice, this is good, and this is what we'd like you to look at, Curt.
Yeah, and also that will help inform your, staff can give you some draft. I like to give you, just like we did here, 2 or 3 draft, very preliminary goals, but they're intended just as placeholder goals, just kind of start a discussion. And I also think certainly before you do actually have an RFQ, you want to have the public weigh in on what your goals should be. What do you want the downtown to do for you?
So help me understand those. So we've got the Niven Price building. We have historical, show us a picture. So pretty much have a view of what that building would look like. What is it that we're going out to look for that particular project? I get the rest of
Oh, well, the uses, and even, I will tell you right now, what the State Historic Preservation Office, what they will end up saying you can do and not do with that building is not something that I can tell you, because it really changes. So it's really is the uses that they would put in there, and the different values that those uses would bring. As you know, depending upon the types of uses, it really could be quite different.
What's the current use? It's retail and office.
zoning. What's the zoning?
Oh, MS, Main Street.
So basically, we need to look at that.
Yeah.
And make sure we understand what couldn't go in there.
Yeah, and again, I wouldn't get too worried about that until you have the developers. I mean, this will never happen, but they may come in and say, well, you should put a Cineplex in there. Well, you're not going to want that, but you're just going to want to hear from them, right? You're just going to want to hear what they have to say before you get too far down the line.
All I'm suggesting is you could go look at that list and say, hey, does that resonate with me or not? And then go look as a way to start, because.
Well, think about it.
You're going to go on a road tour?
Yeah.
Tour right away? No, I just kind of, how do we start framing it so we can narrow it down and
Yeah, I mean, that's most likely going to be some type of retail use, restaurant retail use.
Well, that's what the report recommended to us, too.
But this is also the time, this is when you want to be most broad off. What I was suggesting before is just keep your minds open to something else. Whatever if you start to narrow it down now, you're just not going to see anything. So let a developer partner, let some developers inform what you want to look at. And then you're going to narrow it down. It's going to get narrowed down very rapidly from here on in. Once you start, it'll get narrowed down.
Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is we're really pretty far down the road with that building right now. We know what it should look like from the historic drawings that you have in your possession. We have MS, we know what uses are allowed in MS, and unless we want to entertain a zoning change, which probably wouldn't fly in the downtown area going away from MS on Main Street.
We've also have a downtown vision.
Yes, we got those, that's
So
right.
you're gonna wanna give all that information. This is really helpful to potential developers, you know, give them the ULI, give them the artist rendering that you saw, give them your zoning, you're gonna wanna provide all that. And give them the demographic data, I mean, that's gonna also be very important. Give them whatever information you have about, you know, what's happening now with your downtown businesses, how successful they are, you know, what's currently there. So you're gonna wanna provide all that information. So you're right, there's a lot of that.
We're down a path. If the board is in agreement, let's
Yeah.
move forward.
Yeah.
Then we can get that stuff out
Yeah,
there.
yeah, you can get it out pretty quickly.
Because by I'm sorry, but
It's okay.
because by contract, you can limit the uses, go through your MS zoning and say, well, what we do not want in this building.
Correct.
Eliminate what otherwise would be a use of entitlement. In your mind, make that an idea that I don't want that use in this building.
Correct.
So just, on your own, you may want to just look through the MS zoning and start eliminating potential uses that you don't think fits the vision of that building and that block of downtown.
Kurt, it'd be nice to hear from the Main Street Advisory. They have uses that they wouldn't want to see.
They would not want to see. They would not want to see. Yeah.
Or even things that they prefer, that's okay. Yeah, I misinterpreted your question, but I think, yeah, the more information you can provide folks now, you're better off. Don't go down the road if you know you're not gonna be supported on the board or on by the public. Go out.
So Greg, what is your next step and what do you need from us?
I think the board needs to look at some other examples of things that have been successful in your mind and provide us feedback and input about what that would look like. And then we can tailor kind of a sit down with the full board to discuss what that RFP process should start coming together as. What I really do believe is it's going to be important to get those developers in that might have an interest and sit down and talk to them informally before we put something too formal together, because while we are assuming that, or maybe not assuming, but there's a thought that the facade might need to go back to some historic interpretation, you might get a developer that says, I'm gonna put a particular use in there and that facade won't work for that use. The developer might say they have complete interest or no interest in the historic tax credits. So all that really is back on the table as to, okay, if those are the facts that they bring to the table, how much willingness is there on the board to have your vision match whatever set of facts they present? Because
That will tell you how much you want to refine that RFP, the feedback that you get.
So how do we go about going and looking at developers and getting feedback? I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, which ones to look at.
I only suggested that because sometimes.
No, it's fine, where do you start?
I saw, well, what we want to start with is if you saw something in another community that you really thought was cool, let the staff know. Otherwise, they'll identify something. And
Is-
suggest something.
And is that something that the Main Street Advisory Board could provide some utility?
yeah, and this is something that Kurt's been working on for quite a while. The key is what Jim said, though, is there is no development that exactly matches what we have. An existing building that's occupied. It's easy to find a building that's underused. It's easy to find a mill site, a greenfield, all different versions out there. But you're not going to find exactly what we have that's occupied. There'll be something close to it, but this project, while it is complicated and can be long, is not nearly as complicated or as long as some of the other things that are in the state that have done exceedingly well. It just took them a lot of years to get there.
Well, I think to everybody's point, why do we need to take a lot more steps if we really are maybe 90% there already? You know, this has been talked about in the vision plan, it's been talked about at the retreat, it's been talked about by Mr. Buckley before, and what you just said, I mean, that's a very specific building. The only other one in Waxhaw that looks like it is the one on Broome Street that was a new building that fits right in. If we're limited to the uses in MS, which are pretty broad, why do we need to take a bus trip? Do we need to do that? That's what I'm saying. Why take time to repeat something?
And that's again where you want to make sure that you're comfortable, that your concerns are being addressed, and what you want to see happen is being addressed. I just want to caution you that starting at this process, you want to be as broad as possible in terms of what your vision might be, because later on, it's harder. You just lose time if later on you say, oh, I really wanted something just like they did in this other town. I want to do something just like there. Well, it's harder to do that. That's all.
So is it reasonable to think that you guys, there's several going to Main Street, probably see some examples there, maybe bring them back, the rest of the board. If there's other examples, bring those back to the rest of the board. During the month of March, we kind of look at these things as well as the uses and anything we like or something that we just dislike or whatever, get that back to Kurt, to the staff. We use March to do that, so we can start framing to your point, and I'll let the developers kind of come in and talk. We put a little bit of structure around it, but not too limiting, such that we're using March to develop a little bit of foundation in April to get more input such that, we can get going. I'm just chunking it into months so we can be very specific, but start to move. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one of the easiest things to do may be just to look at your schedule calendars for, let's say, April, and carve out 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 times when you could bring in some developers, and then they could use that for dates, because that's usually the trouble, is just trying to find a schedule for some folks. Hopefully that'll work for developers, but if we start, if there's contact early on, you can usually get them in here.
April 1st is opening day for the Cubs. I'm gone. So just be clear.
You're going to go sit in the Wrigley Field. Oh, they're in Atlanta? Oh, well, they won't be getting snowed on in Chicago then. That's good.
I did that once.
All right, anything else I can?
Is that, Greg, do you need more, or is that a good place to start?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'd say that the timing should be a little bit flexible in this next couple of month period. We do have a planning director coming on toward the end of April. I think we sent that out on Friday, so if you saw that, it'd be a good thing to have him here and participating and hearing what those developers said, because that person would work closely with Kurt and the team to kind of help deliver what your vision is for that property.
Well, I hope this was useful, and I appreciate the opportunity. And again, Central Ina wants to thank you for the opportunity to work with you and your staff. We appreciate it. Sure, thanks.